$340,000. That was the number on the letter Roy Holden set face down on the kitchen table without finishing it. June was standing at the stove. She heard the paper touch the wood and did not turn around. She already knew what it said. They had been waiting for it since July. Outside the kitchen window, 280 acres of winter wheat stood gold and full in the September morning. Ready. It had been ready for 4 days. The problem was not the crop. The problem was the machine that would not start. And the man from Wichita who had taken $22,000 to fix it and driven away in a black G-Wagon, leaving it exactly as broken as it was before he arrived. And Holden Farm had been in the same family since 1931. Roy's grandfather had broken the original ground from raw Kansas prairie with a borrowed plow and a team of horses and a belief that the land would return what you put into it if you were willing to put in enough. Roy's father had mortgaged the place twice, once in 1962 and once in 1974, and paid it back both times without missing a payment. The farm had survived drought and low prices, and 2 sons who left for the city and 1 who stayed. Roy had stayed. He had never seriously considered doing otherwise, because the land was not a business decision to him. It was the only life he understood how to live. The John Deere 444 sat at the edge of the east field like something that had simply decided to stop participating. It was a 1979 model, 6 cylinders, 130 horsepower, a tractor Roy's father had called the best machine International Harvester ever had to fear. Roy had saved 3 years to have it rebuilt. In August, Pinnacle Agritech had come out from Wichita with 2 trucks and 4 men and spent 11 days on the engine, the hydraulics, the fuel system, the electrical. $22,000. Roy had borrowed the money from Pinnacle directly under a separate agreement from the bank loan. With a 30-day repayment clause, he had not read carefully enough. If the harvest did not happen, he would lose the farm from 2 directions at once. He had not told June about the Pinnacle loan. He had intended to. And then the tractor stopped working. And after that, there never seemed to be a moment where telling her would not make everything worse. We'll say then. When Pinnacle finished the rebuild, the foreman had shaken Roy's hand and said the tractor was better than factory new. Roy believed him. He had no reason not to. 3 days later, the John Deere would not start. Not a slow start. Not a rough start. Nothing. The engine turned. The starter worked. Fuel reached the injectors. The battery held voltage. Everything that was supposed to happen appeared to be happening. And yet the tractor sat in the September heat as though something inside it had decided that forward was not a direction it intended to travel. Roy called Pinnacle. Pinnacle sent Marcus Webb back out the following morning. Marcus ran diagnostics for 4 hours, replaced the fuel relay, checked the injection timing, tested the glow plugs, and left without the tractor starting. He said he would report back to the office and have a senior engineer review the data. That was 8 days ago. Roy had made 11 phone calls since then. He had spoken to Marcus twice and to a woman at the front desk 7 times. He had driven to the co-op and asked 2 other mechanics to look at the tractor. The first spent 90 minutes with it and left shaking his head. The second lasted 40 minutes before he said the problem was above his experience level and Roy should contact the manufacturer directly. The wheat kept ripening. The bank kept counting. The John Deere sat in the field and said nothing. June called Elias Boone on a Sunday evening. She did not call because Roy asked her to. Roy had not suggested it and would not have, because Roy was not the kind of man who admitted when he had run out of options. June called because she had grown up 2 farms over from the Boone property, and she remembered something her own father had said once. Standing in their driveway watching an old man walk a field with his eyes half shut and his hands in his pockets. Her father had said that Elias Boone could hear a machine think. She also called because she knew about the Pinnacle loan. She had found the paperwork in the filing cabinet in July when she was looking for the insurance documents. She had read it and put it back and said nothing, because Roy had not told her, and she understood why he had not told her, and she had decided that the most useful thing she could do with that information was not confront him about it, but find a way to make it not matter. The phone rang 6 times before Elias picked up. He still had the rotary phone in the kitchen, the one that hung on the wall beside the window that looked out over the empty pasture where his cattle used to be. June told him about the tractor. She told him about the bank. She told him about the 96 hours in a voice that stayed steady until it did not. And then she stopped talking for a moment, and Elias waited without filling the silence. When she finished, he said he would come in the morning. He did not ask what Pinnacle had already tried. He didn't ask for the diagnostic reports. He asked one thing only, and it was not a technical question. He asked how long the tractor had sat unused before Pinnacle came out to rebuild it. June said she thought about 2 years, maybe a little more. They had bought it from an estate sale over in Custer County, and it had been sitting in the previous owner's barn since 2001. Elias said he would be there at 7. He was there at 6:45. Roy was already in this yard when the old Ford pickup turned off the county road. It was a 1988 F-150 dark green, with a crack in the passenger side mirror that had been there so long it had become part of the truck's character. Elias stepped out slowly. He was 76 years old and built the way men who spent their lives doing physical work are built. Not large, but settled into himself, as though gravity had done its work and he had made peace with the arrangement. He wore a canvas work jacket the color of dried mud and carried nothing except a small notebook with a brown leather cover, worn smooth at the corners from 4 decades of daily handling. Roy had known Elias Boone for 30 years. They were not close friends in the way that men who talk easily are close friends. They were close in the way that men who respect each other across a long distance are close, which is sometimes the more durable kind. Elias had helped Roy's father with a combine problem in 1987 and had come to his father's funeral in 1991 and had occasionally appeared at the edge of a problem over the years, in the way that certain people appear when things are serious, without being called and without needing to explain why they came. Roy shook his hand. Elias nodded once, looked at the sky, then looked toward the east field where the tractor sat. He said, "That is a good crop." Roy said it would not be a crop at all if they could not cut it. Elias nodded and began walking toward the field. Pinnacle Agritech arrived 40 minutes later. Derek Slade came in a black Mercedes G-Wagon that was not designed for gravel roads, but managed them without complaint because that was the kind of vehicle it was. He stepped out wearing a gray sport coat over a collared shirt and shoes the color of expensive things. He was 38 years old and had the bearing of a man who had been told he was impressive often enough that he had stopped needing other people to confirm it. Behind him came Marcus Webb in a white Pinnacle truck, and behind Marcus came a second truck carrying equipment cases. Derek walked toward Roy with his hand extended and his phone already out, scrolling something with his thumb while the handshake happened. He said his company understood the urgency and that he had personally driven from Wichita to ensure the situation was resolved before the bank's deadline. He said this the way a person says something they have said before and expect to be thanked for. Then he saw Elias. The old man was standing beside the John Deere with his hands at his sides, not touching the tractor, not walking around it, simply standing near it the way a person stands near something they are trying to read. His leather notebook was in his left hand, closed. Derek looked at Roy. Roy said Elias Boone was there to take a look. Derek's expression shifted in the small ways that expressions shift when a person is deciding how seriously to take a situation. He said that was fine, that the more eyes the better. And then he walked toward the equipment truck and began directing the unloading of a black hard-sided case roughly the size of a small refrigerator. Marcus Webb hung back. He was 34 years old and had the compact, efficient movements of someone trained to work in tight spaces. He looked at Elias the way a person looks at something they were not expecting to see in a place they know well. His jaw tightened slightly. He said nothing. He picked up a cable harness from the truck bed and carried it toward the tractor. Elias watched him cross the yard with the patient attention of a man reading weather. Marcus had come to Elias at 17, the summer after his father sold the family property outside Coldwater and moved the family to Wichita. The boy had shown up at Elias's shop on a Tuesday morning with nothing to recommend him except a willingness to stay until the work was done and an instinct for listening to machines that Elias recognized because he had felt it himself at the same age. He had kept Marcus on for 6 years. He had taught him everything he knew about reading a machine before touching it, about the difference between what a system reported and what it was actually doing, about the patience that separated a mechanic from a parts changer. In 1995, Marcus had left for the university engineering program in Manhattan, and Elias had wished him well and meant it. He had not expected the boy to end up at Pinnacle, but he had understood it. The diagnostic equipment took 20 minutes to connect. Marcus ran cables from the black case to the tractor's electrical harness at 4 junction points, while Derek explained the system to Roy and Sheriff Cole Briggs, who had stopped by that morning out of what he called professional courtesy, and what was the same mixture of concern and curiosity that brought communities together around problems that mattered. Derek said the system read 847 separate data points from the tractor's electrical and fuel systems simultaneously. He said it had been developed in partnership with a university engineering department and could identify fault conditions that conventional diagnostics missed entirely. He said the software had been updated as recently as last spring. Briggs asked what it had found so far. Derek said the initial sweep was still running, but that the previous session's data had shown the engine at 94% efficiency across all measured parameters. He said that according to every metric the system could read, the tractor was fully capable of starting. Briggs looked at the tractor. He looked at Roy. He said, "Well, it does not appear to know that." Nobody laughed. It was not that kind of morning. Across the field, Elias had begun walking slowly around the John Deere. He completed one full circuit without touching the machine. Then he stopped at the left rear corner and stood still. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man tilts his head when a sound is not matching what he expected to hear. Then he moved to the front and crouched, slowly, one hand on his knee for balance, and studied the area below the engine block without touching anything. Derek noticed this and walked over. He stood a few feet from Elias and watched him for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask what you are looking for specifically?" Elias did not look up. He said he was not looking for anything specifically. Derek said the system connected to the tractor was running a diagnostic sequence that would take a trained engineer 3 weeks to replicate manually. If there was a fault in the electrical or fuel delivery system, the system would find it. Elias stood up slowly. He looked at the front of the tractor. Then he looked at Derek. He said, "What does your system read from the accessory drive?" Derek said he would have to check the data. Elias nodded and walked around to the right side of the engine bay. Derek went back to the laptop. The morning moved the way September mornings move in Kansas, with a light wind off the fields and a sky that had not yet committed to anything. Roy stood near the fence with his arms crossed. June brought coffee out at 8:30 and nobody said much while they drank it. At 9:15, Derek called everyone over to look at the laptop screen. The display showed a grid of data points in green and yellow with 2 items flagged in orange. He explained that the system had identified a slightly elevated resistance reading in one of the relay circuits and a marginal voltage drop in the secondary electrical bus. He said neither was severe enough to prevent starting under normal conditions, but that replacing both components was the recommended course of action. He said the parts could be sourced from Wichita by the following morning and installed before noon, which would leave time before the bank's deadline. Roy asked if that would fix it. Derek said the data strongly suggested yes. Roy looked at Elias. Elias was standing at the edge of the group, looking not at the laptop but at the section of the engine that housed the accessory drive belt system. He had not spoken in 40 minutes. Roy said, "Elias, what do you think?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ask him what version of the service manual his software uses." Derek heard this. He said the system was based on the comprehensive John Deere technical documentation database, updated through the most recent published revision, Elias said. "Which revision?" Derek looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the ground. Elias opened his leather notebook and turned to a page near the back. He read something quietly to himself. Then he closed it. He looked at Derek and said, "The 4440 had a service manual revision in 1981, 2 years after the machine was first produced. The accessory drive assembly specifications changed between the original 1979 documentation and the 1981 revision. Not dramatically, but enough." Derek said the system accounted for all published revisions. Elias said the 1979 specification was a field service bulletin, not a formal revision. It was distributed to regional dealers by paper mail. Most of it never made it into the central documentation system. The laptop continued its diagnostic sequence. A crow landed on the fence post near the east field and sat there with the particular indifference of a bird that has seen a great many things and found most of them unremarkable. Derek said, "With respect, that is a long time ago." Elias said, "Yes, that is correct." He walked back to the tractor and placed his hand flat against the surface of the accessory drive housing, just resting it there. Roy watched him. June watched from the porch steps. Marcus watched from beside the equipment truck with an expression that was difficult to read and not quite unreadable. Sheriff Briggs set his coffee mug on the hood of his cruiser. He said, "Elias, in your opinion, what is wrong with this machine?" Elias kept his hand against the housing. He said, "I think there are 2 things wrong with it. I think one of them is in this housing, And I think the other one is somewhere else entirely, Briggs said. Do you know what they are? Elias said. Not yet, but I know where they are not. Derek said his team would proceed with sourcing the replacement components and the tractor would be running by Wednesday at the latest. Roy said Wednesday might be too late. Derek said the timeline was what it was and the system had spoken clearly. Elias opened his notebook and wrote something slowly, in the deliberate way of a person who writes things down because they intend to remember them exactly. Then he closed it and looked out at the wheat. 280 acres, gold and full and waiting. At noon, Derek drove back toward town for a call. The equipment stayed connected to the tractor, running its sequence, logging its 847 data points. Marcus stayed behind. He spent an hour at the equipment truck, checking cables, entering commands into the laptop, doing the things a man does when he is working, and also doing the things a man does when he is waiting to be alone with someone. At 1 o'clock, Roy went inside for lunch. June followed. Briggs had left at 11. The yard went quiet. Marcus walked across the field toward the tractor. He stopped a few feet from his old teacher and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You trained me for 6 years," Elias said. "I know how long I trained you." Marcus looked at the tractor. He said, "I flagged the documentation gap 14 months ago. I wrote a formal memo to the technical director saying the 1979 field service bulletins were not captured in the database and that the accessory drive specifications for early production 4440 GOES might be misrepresented in the system." Elias waited. Marcus said, "I was told the risk was negligible. The memo was filed. Nothing changed," Elias said. "And you stayed." Marcus did not answer that directly. He said, "If I say anything in front of Slade, I'm finished. Not just at Pinnacle. He has relationships across the whole industry in this region." Elias looked at him. He said, "I understand." Marcus said, "I'm sorry." Elias said, "I know you are." He did not say anything else about it. He opened his notebook and looked at something on the page. Marcus stood beside him for another minute, then walked back toward the equipment truck. Elias stood alone beside the John Deere as the afternoon light moved across the Kansas field. The wheat moved in long, slow waves, a motion that looked almost like breathing. He placed his hand against the engine housing again, this time lower, near the base of the accessory drive assembly, and stayed like that for a long time. Around 3 in the afternoon, Derek returned. He said the replacement parts had been confirmed and would arrive by 7 the following morning. He went through the logistics of the next day's installation, estimating 2 hours of work, leaving a margin before the bank's 3 o'clock deadline. Roy came out of the house and stood in the yard. He said, "What if it does not start after the parts are installed?" Derek said the data was clear. The system had identified the fault conditions. Roy said the system had identified fault conditions 8 days ago and the tractor still did not start. Derek said the previous session had identified areas of interest. This session had produced specific fault identification. There was a difference. Roy looked at Elias. Elias was looking at the accessory drive housing. Roy said, "Elias, I need to know what you think. Not what you suspect, what you think." Elias was quiet long enough that Derek started to speak again and then stopped. Then Elias said, "I think the problem is in this drive assembly. And I think there is a second problem that has nothing to do with the electrical system. And I think your system will not find either one because both of them exist in a version of this tractor that your database does not contain." Derek said that was a significant claim without supporting evidence. Elias patted the engine housing once, gently. Then he looked at Derek and said, "I've been supporting it for 40 years. It is all in here." He held up the leather notebook. Derek looked at it the way a man looks at something he cannot quite place in a category. Not a digital device, no screen, no battery, paper and leather and pencil lead, and 40 years of a man paying attention. And there was nothing in the Pinnacle Agritech service agreement that accounted for any of that. Then Derek said, "We will have this resolved by tomorrow afternoon." He went back to the laptop. Roy walked over to Elias and stood beside him. He said, "Can you fix it?" Elias looked at the tractor. A long moment passed with nothing in it except wind and the distant sound of a truck on the county road. He said, "I need a little more time." Roy nodded. He didn't ask how much time. He did not ask what Elias had found or what he suspected or what the notebook said. He had known Elias Boone for 30 years, and he understood that when Elias said he needed a little more time, he was not stalling. He was listening. And in 40 years of fixing machines that other people had given up on, Elias Boone had learned something no diagnostic system had been built to replicate, which was that a machine that will not run is not broken in the way a bone is broken or a wire is broken. It is broken in the way a conversation is broken, not by what is being said, but by the absence of something that should be present, by a silence where there should be sound. He stood beside the John Deere as the light went gold across the Kansas field. He was 76 years old. His knees ached from standing on hard ground all day. His wife had been dead 4 years, and he still sometimes reached for the phone to tell her things, and then remembered. He had a notebook with her name written inside the cover in her own handwriting. Eleanor Boone, in blue ink. On the page she had pressed her pen to in 1971 when she gave it to him and told him to write down everything he learned, because she said the things a person learns over a lifetime are worth keeping. He had been keeping them ever since. He opened the notebook and turned to page 47. The notes there were from 1983, Custer County, Nebraska, a farm called Whitfield, a 1979 John Deere 444 that had sat unused in a barn for 2 seasons and refused to start after being partially serviced by a dealer working from a manual that did not match the machine. He read the notes slowly. Then he looked up at the tractor. The September light settled over the east field. In the distance, the wheat stood patient and golden and entirely indifferent to deadlines. Elias closed his notebook and put it in his pocket. He was not finished yet, but for the first time since he had arrived that morning, he was certain he was looking in the right direction. He did not sleep well that night. Not because of the ache in his knees, though that was present, and not because of the wind that came up around midnight and moved through the eaves of his farmhouse, finding every gap and making itself known. He did not sleep because page 47 was open on the kitchen table, and he kept returning to it in his mind. Not to the words exactly, but to the space between them, to what he had written and what he had not written, and whether the distance between those two things contained the answer he was still looking for. He was at the Holden farm before sunrise. Roy was already in the yard with a cup of coffee, standing in the dark the way farmers stand before a day they are not sure they are ready for. He handed Elias a second cup without being asked. They stood together and watched the sky go from black to gray to the particular pale orange that comes just before the sun clears the horizon in Kansas in September, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing useful to say yet. The wheat was still there, still gold, still waiting. The Pinnacle truck arrived at 6:58. Marcus came first, alone, and began checking the equipment connections without looking up. Derek's G-Wagon followed at 7:12, and he stepped out already on his phone, holding up one finger in Roy's direction as though Roy had said something that required a pause. The replacement parts were in a white box in the back of Marcus's truck. A relay assembly and a secondary bus component, both new, both in manufacturer packaging. Marcus set them on the tailgate and laid out his tools with the precision of someone who has performed this operation many times and finds no comfort in repetition. Derek finished his call and walked over. He said the installation would take approximately 90 minutes. He said based on everything the diagnostic system had shown, the tractor would start before 9, which would give them more than 6 hours before the bank's deadline. He said it with the confidence of a man who has never been seriously wrong about something in front of people who needed him to be right. Elias stood near the front of the tractor and said, "Mthang." He had been studying the accessory drive housing since he arrived, not with his hands, not yet, but with the attention of someone returning to a sentence they read the night before and finding it means something different in the morning light. He had his notebook open to page 47, and he glanced at it occasionally, then back at the machine. The way a person checks a map, not because they are lost, but because they want to be certain they are reading the terrain correctly. Marcus installed the relay first. It took 40 minutes. He worked cleanly and without unnecessary motion. Tools returned to the same position after each use. No step skipped, no shortcut taken. Whatever else had changed in the years since he left, that much had stayed. The secondary bus component took another 35 minutes. Derek observed for the first 20 minutes and then went to answer another call, standing at the edge of the yard with his back to the tractor. At 8:47, Marcus stepped back from the engine bay and said it was ready. Roy climbed into the seat. Sheriff Briggs had returned that morning, again out of professional courtesy, standing near the fence with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back slightly. June stood on the porch steps with her hands folded. Elias stood at the front left corner of the tractor, not watching Roy, watching the engine. Roy turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned with good speed, the kind of speed that means the battery is strong and the starter is working exactly as it should. It turned for 3 seconds, 4. Then the engine caught, a single brief compression that sounded almost like ignition, a sound that made June take 1 step forward on the porch and made Briggs straighten up from the fence. Then it died. 1 compression, then silence. Roy tried again. The starter turned the engine through 12 full revolutions, and nothing happened. He tried a 3rd time. Nothing. He released the key and did not move for a moment. 11 days of waiting had taught him what silence from that engine sounded like, and it sounded exactly like this. Derek had come back from his call. He stood near Marcus with his phone at his side. He looked at the laptop screen. His jaw moved slightly, the small movement of a man recalculating something he was certain he had already calculated correctly. He said, "Try it again." Roy looked at him. Then he looked at Elias. Elias had not moved. His head was tilted slightly to the left. His eyes were moving slowly across the front of the engine in the way eyes move when they are not looking at any single thing, but reading the whole of something. Roy tried it again. The engine turned. It did not catch at all this time, not even briefly. The starter ran through its cycle, and the John Deere sat in the September morning as silent and indifferent as it had been for the past 11 days. Derek said, "That should not have happened." Nobody responded to that. Marcus was looking at his old teacher. Elias had not moved. Then Elias said, quietly, to no one in particular, "There it is," Roy said. "What?" Elias stepped closer to the engine and placed his right hand against the surface of the accessory drive housing. He held it there. The engine had been cranking and was warm from the effort, and he could feel through his palm whatever the metal was telling him. He said, "Roy, try it one more time and stop when I raise my hand." Roy tried it. The starter engaged. Elias stood with his palm flat against the housing and his eyes closed. 4 seconds. 5. His hand came up. Roy released the key. Elias opened his eyes and looked at Marcus. He said, "Come here." Marcus walked over. Elias pointed to a section of the accessory drive assembly near the lower mounting bracket. He said, "Put your hand there." Marcus put his hand there. He pressed gently. Then he pressed again, and this time his hand stilled. His expression changed, not dramatically, but it changed. He said, "It is loaded wrong," Elias said. "Yes." The accessory drive on the 1979 John Deere 4440 in the original field service specification required the belt to be loaded from the lower bracket upward, with the tensioner set against the belt from below. The 1981 revised manual had changed this, standardizing the loading direction to match newer production models. The change was minor enough that it made no difference under most operating conditions, but under cold start conditions, when the engine needed maximum rotational efficiency to reach ignition speed, the incorrectly loaded belt created enough lateral friction against the tensioner to steal precisely the margin the engine needed. The diagnostic system had measured the result, a slightly elevated resistance reading, but had attributed it to the relay circuit because that was where the electrical signature of the problem appeared. The actual cause was mechanical and upstream of any sensor in the system. Marcus stood with his hand against the housing and did not say anything. Derek came over. He asked what they were looking at. Marcus explained it in technical language, precise and flat. Derek listened. His face did not change. He asked how this had been missed during installation. Marcus said, "Because the installation was performed according to the revised manual." Derek said, "Which is the standard?" Marcus said, "It is the standard for machines built after 1981. This machine was built in 1979 and assembled to the original specification. The original specification was distributed as a field service bulletin in 1979 and 1980. It was never formally incorporated into the revision cycle. So it is not in the database." Derek said that information should have been caught in pre-installation research. Marcus said, "Yes." A long moment passed. Derek looked at Elias. Elias was already walking around to the right side of the engine. Derek said, "So this is the fault. We correct the belt loading and the tractor starts." Elias paused. He did not turn around. He said, "That is one of them." Derek said, "One of them?" Elias said, "Yes." Derek looked at Marcus. Marcus did not look back at him. "The belt tensioner was corrected in 25 minutes. Marcus worked with the efficiency of someone who understands that time has become a different kind of thing than it was this morning. Roy had stopped watching the work. He was looking at the wheat instead, standing with his arms at his sides, not folded, not in his pockets, just hanging there the way arms hang when a man has run out of things to do with them. The sun was at its highest now, and the heat came off the gravel in visible waves. 280 acres. The grain looked almost luminous in the direct light, the way things look when you are trying to memorize them. June had gone inside. Standing on the porch watching was a thing she could only do for so long before it cost more than she had. Briggs stayed. He leaned against his cruiser with his coffee gone cold and watched without speaking. When Marcus finished, he stepped back and looked at Elias. Elias was standing at the front of the tractor again, not near the accessory drive, near the air cleaner assembly on the left side of the engine. He was looking at it with the quality of attention he had brought to everything else that day, patient and without urgency, the way attention feels when it is not performing but simply present. He said, "Roy." Roy turned from the wheat. Elias said, "Try it now." Roy climbed into the seat. He turned the key. The starter engaged with the same healthy speed as before, and the engine turned through its cycle, and this time something was different. Not ignition, not yet, but something was different in the rhythm of the compression strokes, a slight increase in speed that everyone in the yard could hear, even if most of them could not have explained what they were hearing. The engine stumbled. A single compression, harder than before, more committed. Then a second. Then it died. But it had gotten further. Roy kept both hands on the wheel. He did not look at Derek. He looked at Elias, and Elias was already nodding. He said, "There it is." Derek said, "It still did not start." Elias said, "No, but now it is trying to." He walked to the air cleaner assembly and put both hands on it, not to move it, just touching it the way you touch something you were trying to understand without disturbing. Then he looked at Marcus and said, "When was this replaced?" Marcus pulled out his copy of the work order, found the line, and said it had been replaced in the initial August installation. New unit, matching part number, sourced from the regional distribution center, Elias said. Matching part number as of what year? Marcus looked at the work order. He looked at the part number. He said, "The part number goes back to 1983. Elias said, "And what changed in 1981? Marcus was quiet. Then, slowly, he said, "The secondary intake chamber." Elias said, "Yes." Derek said, "The part number is the same." Elias said, "The part number is the same. The internal geometry of the secondary intake chamber is not. The manufacturer changed the baffle angle in 1981 to improve flow efficiency on newer engine variants. The change was incorporated into existing part numbers without a revision suffix because the manufacturer classified it as a running production change rather than a design change. On engines built to the 1979 specification, the new baffle geometry reduces intake velocity at low RPM. Not enough to affect normal operation, enough to prevent reliable cold starts, especially in combination with the additional friction load on the accessory drive. The yard was very quiet, Derek said. "That is not possible to know from the part number," Elias said. "No, it is not." He opened his notebook. He held it so Marcus could see the page, page 47, Custer County, Nebraska, 1983. The notes were written in pencil, small and precise, each line level with the one above it despite the absence of ruled lines. Marcus read them without speaking. At the bottom of the page, below the technical observations, there were 2 lines written in different handwriting, darker ink, slightly larger letters, a woman's hand. Marcus read those 2 lines. He looked up at Elias. He started to say something, and then he did not. Elias took the notebook back and closed it. He looked at Derek and said, "Your system found what your system was built to find. The problem in this tractor exists in a version of this machine that your system does not know exists. That is not a fault in the system. It is a limit," Derek said. "If what you are describing is accurate, it represents a significant documentation gap in our technical database," Elias said. "Yes, it does." Derek looked at the tractor. He looked at the laptop screen with its grid of green and yellow and 2 orange flags, none of which had identified either of the 2 actual problems. He looked at Marcus. He said, "Why was this not caught before installation?" Marcus said, "Because I was not asked to look for it. I was asked to follow the work order," Derek said. You have been in this industry for 8 years, Marcus said. Yes. And I flagged the documentation gap 14 months ago, in writing. To the technical director, the memo is on file. The words landed in the yard the way words land when they have been held for a long time and finally find a place to go. Derek did not respond to them. He looked at the laptop again. The diagnostic sequence was still running, logging its 847 data points, finding nothing it had not already found. Briggs had straightened up from the side of his cruiser. He was watching Derek with the attention of a man whose professional life has required him to watch people discover that they are in a situation they cannot manage their way out of. Roy had come away from the fence. He was standing near the tractor, close enough to hear everything. His face was the face of a man who has been afraid for a long time and has gotten practiced at not showing it. But the practice was showing now in the steadiness that is too deliberate, in the stillness that is holding something back. He said, "Can it be fixed? Today?" Elias looked at the air cleaner assembly. He said, "I need the right part." Roy said, "Where do we get it?" Elias said, "Call the Deer dealer in Garden City. Ask for their original parts inventory, pre-1981 units. Tell them you need an air cleaner assembly for a 1979 4440 with the original intake specification. They may have one in the back. Old dealers keep old parts," Roy said. "And if they do not," Elias said, "then we call Hutchinson and then Dodge City." Roy went inside to use the phone. Derek stood near the diagnostic equipment for a long moment. Then he walked to Marcus and spoke in a low voice that was not quite low enough to be private. He said this was not the narrative that was going to leave this farm today. Marcus said, "I'm not sure that is your decision." Derek said, "Marcus, think carefully about what you are doing." Marcus looked at him. He said, "I'm thinking about it right now." He walked away from Derek and went to stand near Elias, who was making a small notation in the notebook with his short pencil. Marcus watched him write and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "The 2 lines at the bottom of that page. That was her writing. It was not a question." Elias did not look up. He said, "She used to read my notes before I went to sleep. She said she wanted to understand what I spent my days thinking about. She wrote comments sometimes. I did not always notice them until later. Sometimes much later." Marcus said, "What did those 2 lines say?" Elias closed the notebook. He said, "She wrote that the problem is almost never where you first look, and that the ones who look longest find what the others missed." He paused. Then he said, "She was usually right about things like that." Marcus nodded. He stood beside the old man for another minute without speaking, and whatever it was that passed between them in that silence was sufficient for both of them. Oh. Roy came back out of the house at 11:15. He walked across the yard with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders carrying the weight of what he was about to say before he said it. He said, "The dealer in Garden City has one, a pre-1981 unit, original specification. It has been in their back inventory since 1987. The parts manager said he almost threw it out twice but never got around to it." He paused. Then he said, "They want $40 for it." Nobody spoke for a moment. Briggs made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said, $40. Roy said, $40. Elias said, "Tell them you will be there in 2 hours. Roy looked at Derek. Derek was standing near the G-Wagon with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man revising several things simultaneously: the situation, his assessment of it, and the version of this day he had planned to report back to his district manager. He said, "Pinnacle will cover the cost of the part, given the circumstances." Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I will get it myself." He got his keys and drove toward Garden City. The yard settled into a different kind of quiet. Marcus made small adjustments to the equipment connections. Briggs refilled his coffee from the thermos in his cruiser. Derek made 2 phone calls, both brief, both conducted with his back to everyone else. June came out of the house at noon with a plate of sandwiches. She set them on the tailgate of Marcus's truck and went back inside without saying anything. Marcus took one. Briggs took one. Elias stood near the tractor and did not eat. Derek did not take one. Elias watched the light change across the field. He had been watching light move across wheat fields for the better part of 6 decades and had not tired of it. The light was still the light. The wheat was still the wheat. Whatever else had changed in the world in those 6 decades, that had not. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about her the way he thought about her often now. Not with the sharp pain of early grief, but with the steady presence that grief becomes after 4 years. less like a wound and more like a change in the weather you have adjusted your life around. She had understood machines the way she understood people, by asking what they needed rather than what they appeared to need. She had asked him once, early in their marriage, why he always walked around something before he touched it. He had said he was looking for what it was trying to tell him. She had said, "That is the same reason I watch people before I talk to them." He had written that down. It was in the notebook. Not page 47, much earlier. Roy returned at 2:30 with a paper bag from the Garden City dealer on the seat beside him. He set it on the tailgate and Elias looked at the part inside without removing it from the bag. He turned it over once. He looked at the intake chamber from the open end and tilted it toward the light. He said, "This is the one." Marcus came over and looked at the internal geometry of the secondary chamber, the angle of the baffle plate, the way the intake path curved before reaching the main body of the filter. He said, "The angle is different," Elias said. 6 degrees. Enough. Derek came over and looked at the part. He held it for a moment. He did not say anything. Marcus began removing the existing air cleaner assembly. The work took 40 minutes because doing it correctly on a 4440 required accessing a mounting bracket at the rear of the assembly that was awkward to reach. And Marcus refused to use a shortcut that would have saved 10 minutes and risked scratching the intake manifold surface. He had learned that from Elias a long time ago, in a different yard in a different county. Elias watched him work. He did not offer direction because Marcus did not need it. What he had taught the man was present in every movement, in the economy of effort, in the refusal to hurry past the part of the job that required patience. At 3:40, Marcus stepped back from the engine and said it was ready. Elias looked at the tractor. He looked at the accessory drive housing where the belt was now loaded correctly, and at the air cleaner assembly where the original 1979 intake geometry now sat in the position it had been designed to occupy. 2 small things, both invisible to the diagnostic system, both discovered not by any technology that Pinnacle Agritech possessed, but by a 76-year-old man with a leather notebook and 40 years of written memory. He said, "Roy." Roy climbed into the seat. His face had the careful steadiness of a man who has been disappointed enough times in a short period that he has decided not to form an expectation, and who has discovered that this is not actually possible, that hope is not something you choose to have or not have, but is simply there, present and dangerous, regardless of what you decide about it. June came to the porch doorway and stood there. Briggs pushed off from his cruiser and stood straight. Marcus took 3 steps back from the engine and crossed his arms. Derek stood near the G-Wagon with his phone at his side and his jacket pushed back by the Kansas wind. Roy put his hand on the key. He looked at Elias. Elias gave him one small nod. Roy turned the key. The starter engaged. The engine turned faster than it had turned all day. A smooth, consistent speed with no drag, no hesitation, nothing stealing the margin it needed. 2 revolutions, 3, and then on the 4th revolution the John Deere 4440 caught. Not a stumble, not a brief compression that died. It caught the way an engine catches when everything is correct, with a sudden full-throated authority that filled the yard, 6 cylinders firing in sequence, the exhaust stack releasing a single dark puff and then steadying into a clean, even beat that you could feel in your chest if you were standing close enough. Roy sat in the seat and did not move. The tractor ran. It ran with the steady rhythm of a John Deere diesel at idle. A sound that everyone in that yard had heard before, but that sounded different now than it had ever sounded. Different because of what it had taken to arrive at it. Different because of what it meant. June pressed both hands over her mouth. Briggs said something under his breath that nobody else heard. Marcus stood with his arms crossed and looked at the ground for a moment, then looked up at the exhaust stack, and then looked at Elias. Elias was watching the machine run with the focused attention of someone who is not satisfied by the beginning of a thing until they have observed it long enough to be certain it intends to continue. 40 seconds. A minute. The idle steadied and smoothed and the sound from the exhaust became consistent and even. Then Elias nodded once. He took the leather notebook from his jacket pocket and opened it to page 47. Below the pencil notes in his own hand, below the 2 lines in Eleanor's darker ink, he wrote 3 words at the bottom of the page with his short pencil. Then he closed the notebook and put it back in his pocket. Derek Slade had not moved from his position near the G-Wagon. He stood with the wind moving through his jacket and the sound of the running tractor filling the yard, and the laptop behind him still logging its 847 data points, still finding nothing it had not already found. He looked at the paper bag on the tailgate with a $40 air cleaner assembly that had been sitting in a dealer's back inventory since 1987, and at the corrected belt tensioner that had taken 25 minutes to fix once someone knew what to fix, and at the notebook in the pocket of a 76-year-old man who had driven out before sunrise in a 1988 pickup truck and stood in a field all day without billing anyone anything. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Roy climbed down from the tractor. The machine continued running behind him, steady and unhurried, as though it had simply been waiting for the right conversation. He walked over to Elias and they watched the tractor together without speaking. Then Roy said, "I need to call the bank." Elias said, "Yes, you do." Roy went inside. The tractor ran on in the September afternoon, its exhaust rising straight up in the still air above the Kansas field, the sound of it carrying out across the wheat, across 280 acres of grain that would now be cut before the deadline, that would now be delivered and sold and applied against a debt that had come within 96 hours of ending 3 generations of a family's connection to a piece of ground they had never stopped believing was worth keeping. Roy did not cut wheat that afternoon. He let the John Deere run in the yard for 2 hours, walking around it the way you test ice before you commit your weight to it. The engine did not falter. The idle did not rough up. The exhaust stayed clean and the temperature gauge held steady in the middle of its range, exactly where a healthy 4440 was supposed to hold. At 5 o'clock, Roy shut it down. He sat in the seat for a moment after the engine stopped in the sudden quiet of the yard, and then he climbed down and went inside. June made dinner. Elias stayed. Nobody invited him, and nobody needed to. He sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open and made additional notes while June moved around the stove and the smell of something warm and practical filled the old farmhouse. Briggs had gone home at 4. Marcus had loaded the equipment truck and told Roy he would be in touch about the paperwork. Derek had driven away in the G-Wagon before the engine had been running 10 minutes, which told everyone present what they needed to know about how a man like Derek Slade processed a day like this one. The following morning, Roy was in the East Field before sunrise. He had not slept much. He had lain in the dark beside June, listening to the sound of the house and thinking about the tractor and the wheat and the bank and the Pinnacle loan and the $40 and the 76-year-old man who had spent an entire day standing in a field, listening to something no one else had thought to listen for. At 4:30, he got up and put on his work clothes and went out to the yard. The John Deere started on the first turn of the key. He sat in the seat for a moment with the engine running around him, feeling the vibration through the frame and the seat and his hands on the wheel, the deep familiar presence of a machine that is doing what it was built to do. Then he turned on the headlights and drove into the field. The wheat came down in long, clean passes, the header cutting through the standing grain in a sound that Roy had heard every harvest of his adult life, and that never sounded the same twice because the circumstances were always different. This morning, it sounded like relief. It sounded like 3 generations of a family not losing something that had never been just a piece of land. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, he had finished the first quarter of the field. June came out at 7 with coffee and stood at the edge of the stubble watching him work. She did not wave. She just stood there with the cup in both hands and watched the machine move through the wheat, and that was enough for both of them. By noon, he had finished half. By 4 in the afternoon, with the light going amber across the fresh-cut stubble, he had completed everything that could be cut before the dew came up. He would finish the remaining 80 acres over the following 2 days. The grain went to this elevator in Garden City. The price that week was adequate, not exceptional, but adequate, which was what Roy had needed it to be. The check from the elevator came on Friday. Roy drove to First Garfield Bank on Saturday morning and made a payment that reduced the outstanding balance enough to stop the foreclosure proceedings and establish a repayment schedule that the bank, reconsidering its position in the presence of a functioning harvest and a farmer who had clearly not given up, agreed to extend. Holden Farm did not change hands that September. The matter of Pinnacle Agritech took longer to resolve and resolve the way matters involving contracts and professional liability tend to resolve, quietly and without public announcement, in letters exchanged between parties who have concluded that the cost of continuing to disagree is higher than the cost of reaching an arrangement. Roy had asked Elias to write down what he had found. Elias had done this over 2 evenings at his kitchen table, working from his notes on page 47 and from memory, producing a document that described both technical failures in plain language and traced each one to its origin in Pinnacle's use of post-1981 documentation for a pre-1981 machine. He wrote it the way he wrote everything, without drama and without accusation, as a simple accounting of what had been present and what had not been present and what the consequences of that had been. Roy's cousin in Wichita, who practiced contract law, read the document and then read the service agreement Roy had signed with Pinnacle and then sat quietly for a moment before he said that Pinnacle had a problem. The problem was that the service agreement included a warranty of workmanship written broadly enough to encompass the installation of components appropriate to the specific machine being serviced. A 1979 John Deere 444, installed with components calibrated to a 1981 specification, was not, under a reasonable reading of that warranty, a machine that had received workmanship appropriate to its specific configuration. $22,000 had been paid for a service that had not produced a functioning machine. 11 days had passed during harvest season while the machine sat inoperative. The consequential losses during those 11 days were documentable. Roy's cousin also read the separate Pinnacle loan agreement. He read the 30-day repayment clause and the terms that gave Pinnacle the right to recover equipment in the event of non-payment. He was quiet for a longer moment this time. Then he said, "Roy, this loan agreement is also a problem, for them, not for you. A company cannot hold a service warranty and a secured loan on the same piece of equipment they failed to properly service. The conflict of interest is significant." Roy said he had not read it carefully enough when he signed it. His cousin said, "I know, but I am reading it carefully now." He sent a letter to Pinnacle's legal department on a Wednesday. Pinnacle's legal department responded the following Monday. The response did not admit liability. It proposed a conversation. The conversation happened over 3 weeks through a series of calls and counter-proposals that Roy did not participate in directly because his cousin advised him not to, telling him that the most powerful position in a negotiation is often the one occupied by the person who is not in the room. Roy spent those 3 weeks cutting his remaining fields, servicing his equipment, and doing the 100 things that need doing on a working farm in September and October when the season is moving, whether you are ready or not. On the 14th of October, Pinnacle Agritech agreed to refund the full $22,000 of the service contract. The separate loan agreement, the one with the 30-day repayment clause, was forgiven in its entirety as part of the same settlement. The agreement contained a non-disclosure provision regarding the specific terms, which Roy's cousin advised him to sign, and which Roy signed. Derek Slade was not named in the settlement. He remained employed by Pinnacle. But Marcus Webb tendered his resignation the week after the settlement was signed, citing in his resignation letter a difference in professional values that he described in 3 sentences and did not elaborate on. He returned to Garfield County and opened an independent equipment repair operation out of a rented shop on the county road outside of Coldwater. His first 3 clients came to him because Roy Holden had mentioned his name. It was Marcus who told Elias about the settlement, calling him on the rotary phone on a Thursday evening in late October. He told him the amount. He told him about the loan forgiveness. He told him about his resignation. There was a long pause on the line when he finished, the quality of silence that comes through telephone wire when neither person is sure what to say next, and both are feeling the weight of something too large to name precisely. Elias said, "Good. I'm glad you are out of there." Did. Marcus said, "I should have been out a long time ago." Elias said, "Yes, but you are out now." Marcus said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without qualification, the way an apology sounds when it has been sitting in a person for a long time and has lost any pretension it might once have had. Elias said, "I heard it in the yard. You do not need to carry it anymore." Marcus said he was going to build something worth building this time. Elias said he believed that. They talked for a few more minutes about equipment, and Elias made a note in the notebook while they talked, and by the time they hung up, the conversation had returned to the thing they both knew best, the language of machines and what they required and what they could tell you if you were willing to spend the time listening. A week later, Roy Holden drove out to Elias's place on a Tuesday afternoon. He came alone, which meant it was a conversation he wanted to have without witnesses. He parked in the gravel drive and came to the door, and Elias let him in, and they sat at the kitchen table where the notebook was open to a blank page near the back. Roy set an envelope on the table. He said, This is for your time. Elias looked at the envelope without picking it up. He said, Roy, you do not owe me anything. Roy said, I owe you the farm. I owe you 3 generations of my family's name on a piece of land. I owe you my wife not having to watch everything her father-in-law built get taken away by a bank that did not care what it was taking. And there is something else. He paused. He said, June told me she found the Pinnacle loan paperwork in July. She said she called you because of it. Because she knew I had not told her, and she knew I would not ask for help, and she decided to do the thing I should have done myself, Elias said. She is a practical woman, Roy said. She is. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I should have told her, Elias said. Yes, Roy said. I know. Neither of them said anything else about it. That was enough. Elias picked up the envelope and opened it and looked at what was inside. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took several bills out, set them on the table, and slid the rest back across toward Roy. Roy looked at what remained. He said, That is $40, Elias said. It is exactly $40. Roy started to speak. Then he stopped. He understood what Elias was doing, and he found he could not argue with it, because the argument would require him to say that the $40 part was not the thing that had saved the farm. And that was not true. The $40 part, sitting in a back room in Garden City since 1987 because a parts manager had never quite gotten around to throwing it out, was precisely the thing that had saved the farm. Along with a 76-year-old man who had known it existed and known where to look for it. Roy folded the remaining bills back into the envelope and put it in his jacket pocket. He said, Will you at least stay for dinner? Elias said. June is not here, Roy said. I can cook, Elias said. Can you? Roy said. I can make something. Elias closed the notebook and stood up from the table. He said, All right, let me get my jacket. They drove back to Holden Farm in Roy's truck, following the county road through the flat October landscape where the cut fields showed their pale stubble and the sky was the high, thin blue that comes to Kansas in autumn when the humidity drops and the air goes clear all the way to the horizon. Roy drove, and Elias looked out the passenger window, and neither of them talked much, which was fine because they had arrived, through different paths, at the understanding that conversation is not always the most honest thing two people can offer each other. June was home when they arrived. She had come back early from her sister's place and was in the kitchen when they walked in. She looked at Roy and then at Elias and then at Roy again, and Roy lifted his shoulders slightly in a way that communicated several things at once. She set a third place at the table without being asked. Dinner was roast chicken and potatoes, the kind of meal that does not require a reason. They ate while the October dark settled over the farm outside the window, and the yard light came on at 6:15 and cast its pale circle over the gravel. The John Deere was visible from the kitchen window, parked at the edge of the equipment shed, done with its work for the season. Roy had washed the harvest mud off it that afternoon. It looked, in the yard light, close to the way it must have looked when it was new. June asked Elias about Eleanor. She asked it directly, the way women who have known each other's families for a long time ask about the dead, without apology and without excessive delicacy. Elias said Eleanor had been gone 4 years in March. He said she had been sick for 8 months before that and had not complained about it in any way he could point to, which was one of the things about her he found he could not talk around no matter how long he had to get used to it. June said she had been at the funeral. She said Eleanor had been one of the clearest-eyed people she had ever known. Elias said, Yes, she was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She read everything I wrote for 32 years. I thought she was being kind. Then I found what she had written in the margin of a page from 1983, and I understood she had been paying closer attention than I had. June said, What did she write? Elias looked at his plate. He said, Something true. That is all I will say about it. The kitchen was quiet. The yard light held its circle outside. Somewhere on the road a truck passed, its sound arriving and leaving in the same breath. Roy said, She sounds like she was a good partner, Elias said. She was the best mechanic I ever knew. She just did not work on machines. After dinner, Roy walked Elias out to his truck. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that arrives in Kansas in October without negotiation. And the stars above the flatland were very bright because there was nothing between the ground and the sky to interrupt them. Elias opened the truck door and paused and looked out at the field. The cut wheat stubble caught a little of the yard light and the rest of it was dark. 280 acres of darkness that would rest through the winter and be ready again in spring, which was what land did when you gave it the chance. Roy said, "I want to ask you something." Elias waited. Roy said, "When you drove out here that first morning, before you had looked at anything, before you knew what the problem was, did you know you could fix it?" Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the field. He looked at the dark outline of the equipment shed where the John Deere sat. He looked at the stars. Then he said, "I knew I had seen it before. That is not the same thing, but it was enough to come." Roy nodded. Elias got into the truck. He set the notebook on the seat beside him. The dome light in the cab was warm and yellow, and he looked old in it, in the way that people look old when they are briefly and privately visible, without the work of the day organizing their face into something more purposeful. Roy said, "Elias." The old man looked at him. Roy said, "Thank you." Elias started the truck. He let the engine warm for a moment the way you let an engine warm when you are from a generation that understood what engines needed. Then he looked at Roy and said, "Take care of that machine and read the manuals that came with it, not the ones that came after." Roy said, "I will." Elias backed out of the drive and turned onto the county road, the headlights of the old F-150 sweeping across the stubble field as he turned, then straightening and moving south toward his own place 7 miles down the road. Roy stood in the yard and watched until the taillights disappeared into the flat Kansas dark. Inside the cab, Elias drove with the heater on low and the radio off. He drove the way he had driven that road for 30 years, knowing every curve and grade and the particular way the road dropped just before the bridge over the dry creek at mile 4. He did not think about Pinnacle Agritech or Derek Slade or the settlement or any of it. Those things had found their level, which was what things did eventually when the people involved were patient enough to wait. He thought about Marcus Webb, alone in a rented shop in Coldwater, building something worth building. He thought about what it meant to learn from a person and then leave, and then find your way back to what they taught you. Not all at once, and not without cost. He thought it was one of the more honest things a person could do with their life. He crossed the Dry Creek Bridge and the truck moved through the dark toward home. At his kitchen table that night, he opened the notebook to page 47 one more time. He read the technical notes from Custer County, Nebraska, 1983. He read Eleanor's 2 lines in the margin, and he read the 3 words he had written at the bottom of the page that afternoon. After the John Deere had started and Roy had gone inside to call the bank, he had written, "It remembered everything." He looked at those 3 words for a moment. Then he picked up his pencil and wrote one more line below them, smaller than the rest, pressed close to the bottom of the page. He wrote, "And so did I." He closed the notebook. He left it on the kitchen table in the same place it had been for 4 years, the same place Eleanor used to pick it up when she came to read it before bed, the place where it would be when he came down in the morning and opened it again and began the next page. Outside the kitchen window, the Kansas night was still and cold, and the stars were very bright. 7 miles north, a 1979 John Deere 444 sat in a yard at the edge of a field that had been in the same family since 1931. Its engine cold now, resting, holding in its iron and steel and copper and rubber the quiet memory of 2 small things that had been wrong and were now right. In the spring, the field would be planted again. The machine would be needed again. And somewhere in a rented shop on the county road outside Coldwater, a 34-year-old man who had learned his trade from a patient teacher was getting ready to be the kind of mechanic that patient teacher had believed he could become. Some things take longer than they should. That does not mean they do not arrive. Elias Boone turned off the kitchen light and went to bed.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to end. The battles were not sent to break me, they were sent to shape the man I am. Every trial is part of the journey, every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason I can rise. So when the thunder finds me again, and dark clouds gather in the sky, I'll greet them like old companions, because they belong to the journey.